all the while exploiting scientific uncertainty, using decontextualized scientific reporting and flawed studies by non-scholars or pseudoscientists, and you insult and you diminish scientists and politicians who are saying freezing is not an option. But we also can freeze. When we face the issues of the unsustainability of our society, we freeze individually, and we can feel that the problems are too great. And we can end up feeling helpless and that situations are hopeless. And we have lots in our history to see that freezing happens. You know, Neville Chamberlain's response to Nazi aggression in Europe was freezing. But this can't be our message to youth. Fleeing is the second response to danger. And I would think that maybe a comparable way of thinking about fleeing in our current situation, in the current economic situation, is economic stimulus packages. You know, we throw money towards more of the same. Let's build more roads and bridges and stuff that, you know, that's going to solve the economic crisis in Canada. If we support 19th century institutions and industries, things will get better. That's sort of fleeing into a la-la land in some ways. You know, Marshall McLuhan, you know, a great Canadian media theorist, talked about how we move into the future with our eyes firmly planted on the past. He says when faced with a totally new situation, we tend always to attach ourselves to the objects, to the flavors of the most recent past. We look at the present through a rear view mirror. We march backwards into the future. And I was thinking of Stephen Harper in this last comment. He says, Spaceship Earth is still operated by railway conductors. So, you know, fleeing, of course, where are we going to flee to? We can't recommend this to our young people either. We can't recommend fleeing into the past. So the only response that we have for dealing with the issues of unsustainability, of the violence and terror we see in the world, the only response really is through acting, which is, and in terms of those three F's, is fighting. Yet fighting is the response of animals backed into corners with few options. We don't talk about fighting. In fact, we punish kids who fight in schools. We actively discourage fighting. But fighting takes skill, it takes knowledge, strength, and it takes courage if you're going to be successful. It also often takes collaboration, coordination, conversation, and compromise if one's going to fight in a figurative way to achieve one's ends. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about grabbing weapons and cracking heads and things like that. My brother is a plumber in the union in Oregon, and he's a specialist in the head knee cracking, I think is where his master's was in. But we're going to have to, we're all engaged, all of us, in the way all profound revolutions are engaged, which is fighting against our own understandings, our own actions, our own assumptions, and our own presuppositions. We have to force our eyes, keeping with McLuhan's metaphor, away from the rear view mirror, and we've got to look clearly out through the front window, and we've got to look clearly at the future. Our form of fighting has to involve consciously planned responses based on our best knowledge and understandings, recognizing that we have to do the best we can to respond to danger and our fear of responding. And we have to work with the tools that we have at present. Means do influence ends, and the means will have an impact, but we have to fight. And I think, you know, a PSA like Page is really, you know, we look at it in ourselves, and I think we also begin to talk about it with our students. Our response to the future is going to have to be some form of fighting if we're to be successful. To tell youth that they should freeze is not honest and of no use. Dealing with internal fear, I think I'm just going to forget about that. But I think we have to deal with fear. And I'm just going to run out of time otherwise. The hard part about fear is that it's difficult to look into the abyss, you know, and we have to find ways not to get stuck in that fear of looking into the abyss. We have to look at our fears, and we still have to get on with it. We have to find ways to act. Our response to our own fear has to be commitment and courage. And again, courage will come up a lot, I think, today. And we have cultural models, myths from a variety of cultures that give us direction and guidance. For example, Old Testament stories talk about the moment when the Israelites have left Egypt. They wander out, they're fleeing from Pharaoh. They get to the Sea of Reeds. There's an ocean in front of them. They've got Pharaoh coming up in the back, and what are they going to do? The Bible talks about Moses raising his staff and the sea parting. But the rabbis have a different interpretation. They say it had nothing to do with Moses and the staff. They say there was a young man who walked into the water, and he just kept on walking. He kept on walking up to his nostrils, and when he got that deep, then the seas parted. That is, he had to act. He had to do something, full of fear, but he did what he had to do, and the world changed as a result. When we talk to our youth and ourselves about the future, we're going to have to both show and talk about this kind of commitment and this kind of courage. I'd also like to mention another person who I think can tell us something about where we have to go with our fears and the skills that we need. And this is from the martyred Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis for his role in the plot to murder Adolf Hitler. Before he was killed, he wrote, and this speaks to me, he said, "We've spent too much time thinking, supposing that if only we weigh every possibility in advance, everything will somehow happen automatically. We have learned a bit too late in the day that action springs not from thought, but from a readiness for responsibility." So that's part of what we have to, I think, learn ourselves and be willing to teach our students. Their responsibility, to have a readiness for responsibility. And I think, Cynthia, you've obviously learned that somehow. You're perfect, the poster girl for a readiness for responsibility. And that's why I think you were being honored here today. Clearly, facing an uncertain future, as we all do, means facing it together. We have to organize, to talk, to push each other, and pushing is an attribute that youth have always done and done well. And now it's time for it to happen again. And facing the future means that we have to solve the problems that we face collectively, and they're not my personal problem. They're our problems. They're large, and there's many places we can all put our energies. We don't have to all work together on one thing. We can work across a wide span of issues that face us in terms of environment and social justice. We have to kind of find our own individual purposes and help our students find their purposes in life, and then move forwards. And of all the things that I think we have to do, many of these things are not things we necessarily learn by reading and by studying. They're things we learn by doing. Aristotle talked about he said the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. And these are things we all have to do. He says, men become builders by building, lyre players by playing the lyre. So too we become just by doing just acts. We become brave by doing brave acts. We become temperate by doing temperate acts. Those are the things, the virtues of justice, of temperance, of action, of bravery, are things we learn by doing. And we have to find ways to engage ourselves in those and our students in them as well, in those virtues. Courage is going to be particularly important. It's an important virtue for all of us, and it is for youth. Courage is always needed. One of my colleagues at UVic, a First Nations colleague, Jason Price, points out that courage is not that of someone who has gone to war, but he says courage is that of someone who has to face what's in front of them, and does. And we'll need courage to create images of the future that we want to live in, and then possess the courage to map our pathways to the future. One of my religious heroes, a fellow named Rav Nachman, a rabbi, a Hasidic sage from Bratislav, he spoke about courage when he wrote, "The whole world and everything in it is a narrow bridge, and the important thing is to not be afraid at all." And this is a truth for our time, I think. The world that we live in is a narrow bridge into a sustainable, just, healthy future. And yet it's a bridge we are all going to have to cross. Our job as teachers is to learn and to teach the skills necessary to make the crossing. As the Lieutenant Governor said this morning, we have to stand up sometime for what we believe in. And as we stand up, we can't be afraid. Thank you.
Our next presenter will be Elizabeth Mee.